Welcome to episode 511 of the Barcelona podcast, brought to you by the Blue Wire podcast. I'm Nathan Hilton. And yeah, I know everybody's excited to see me again, but it's the guy on the other side of the line I know people are very excited to hear from again. It's Jaleel, aka the Purist. And I'm looking at this outline I have here, Jaleel, that I usually make, and I'm pretty excited about what we're going to get into because usually I stuff it and then I try to jam some stuff at the end. But with the ideas that you've put out recently, I'm pretty excited just to kind of let this one breathe and see where the winds take us. There's Sevilla tomorrow. So my hope is that this is going to be a conversation that is a little more overreaching, that's more about what happened so far this season, what is to come in the next month or two this season. But first and foremost, how you doing today?
I'm doing very well, thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me as always. Very excited to talk more generally, like you said, just to have a chat really and discuss some of the overarching themes that are kind of going to be a constant throughout the season, maybe. So yeah, looking forward to it.
Well, I do feel like with some of the things that you've dove into recently on your YouTube channel, in terms of the way that the Brazilian national team is playing, and prior to that it was Fluminense, and just a guy, just the different ideas in world football right now. And I feel like this is going to be an easier show for you. Kind of just hey, we're just talking about Barcelona. We're just talking about what Xavi's trying to do here. And, I think where we want to begin is a pushback to an idea that, and you and I were talking beforehand, and it might be a vocal minority, and it always is. It's true. It's a vocal minority to say hashtag Xavi out. Now, I think that hashtag Kuman out, that was a little bit louder, and it got louder and louder the
Yeah.
closer it went to him being out. And the same thing with Ernesto Valverde, where it was we'll say, loud minority basically until Liverpool. And then I think everybody kind of agreed he had to go that summer, but yet the club keeps him on. He gets released in January. But at this point, Xavi just renewed until 2020, the summer of 2025, I believe. Yeah, it's 2025. So I think in the case of Xavi, there is still, for most sensible fans, quite the leash left to go, left to go. And yeah, so let's just go through these different games here, Jaleel, because I feel like people say five at the back, and that's getting a bit reductive because in truth, I think each different scenario or each different team brought a different thing, and each game had its own flavor as to what Barca did right and did wrong. And just to run through this real quick, for me, Hadafe, I had said the number one reason Barcelona were losing points in that game was that they were losing their heads. And I think if they keep their heads, I think they just the talent disparity, they win that game. But they allowed the fouling and the breakdowns of Hadafe in any flow and rhythm they might have had in the first game of the season, and they allowed Hadafe to kind of take advantage of that, and they played their game. And I thought that was actually the only problem they could have easily moved on from. Against Cadiz, if you remember, with Rafinha suspended, that was the lots of midfielders game where De Jong played center back, and Barcelona with all those midfielders, and it was possession, it was trying to figure out and break through with those midfielders where you're not getting as many forward runs or runs in behind. But two goals came late when the players did start moving and attacking the space, so that got the job done against Cadiz. Osasuna, remember it was a B team for Osasuna, but they fought hard, they worked hard, that being Osasuna. And that was a weird game because I thought Barcelona were reaching the last third pretty comfortably, but there was again a lack of movement up front and a lack of forward runs from Gavi and Gundogan in that game, and even Lewandowski not really moving too much or creating space for one another. And I also still kind of chalked that game up to Gundogan in particular didn't look comfortable with his teammates yet, and so the service to Lewandowski was kind of starved. But they figured some things out, that being Barcelona. And even though they played the game that Osasuna wanted, they still managed to get points from that because they just played out of pressure confidently, and they were able to exploit those spaces eventually against Osasuna. Celta, we just talked about. That was last week. Poor performances is, again, what I chalked that up to. And then the space in behind Cancelo would be what I would say is the big quote-unquote problem for Xavi to solve from that game. And then against Mallorca, same thing. It's a five at the back, sure, but this is the most Route 1, as I kept hearing, Route 1 football from Mallorca. And
Mhm.
when Barcelona, that being Romeu in particular, lost some aerial duels in the middle of the park to Mariki, whose job is to win those first balls, and then when Mallorca picked up those second balls and won those, then again it was Route 1 football, and Barcelona didn't help themselves because you had some two major mistakes by Marc-Andre ter Stegen, and the combination of Araujo and Inigo Martinez not only not being fit defensively, but also not really breaking through that Mallorca press, where I know we think of fitness as just, physicality and, battling and elbows and shoulders, but I think they also weren't fit in terms of what they were comfortable to do with the ball. Inigo Martinez is much better at those switches, those long horizontal balls. He's much better at that. They didn't seem clean or crisp. And Araujo is more confident than he showed in playing the ball to the free man in the middle. And the third man run was not happening because Araujo was not opening things up with that pinpoint pass in the middle that we've seen that he's improved upon. But having had that layoff, it just seemed like he had lost a little bit of the confidence and wasn't ready to get back to that and hit the ground running. So to me, Jaleel, I feel like I go through the different times when we've argued that Barcelona have struggled this season, and and while yes, there's still very much a work in progress, I feel like each of those games you cherry pick something where, okay, so that was the real issue here. And I don't know, it seems to me that Xavi has a good idea and a good structure, but in terms of trying to attack what he has to improve and work on, I feel like it just seems to be minor things. Like this team, its ceiling is much higher than I think people are starting to give it credit for, even against a five at the back. Like they are creating a lot of chances.
Yeah, and I think there was some stats going around about Barca being the team that has created the most chances in the league, but also wasted the most big chances in the league, and that being against a lot of defensive, low blocks and five at the back systems. So whether that's down to pure quality, you could argue, or whether it's down to structural things, it's not a nightmare by any stretch of the imagination. And I would agree broadly that it is a work in progress. There are definitely, as I tried to point out in a couple of my videos, there were structural issues that I believed were there definitely at the start of the season, certainly against Getafe, that were then improved on. Certainly improved on with the signings as well as just general, structural improvements. And you know, more sort of in more detail and more depth, it is a case of just little things going wrong in every game. I feel certainly against Mallorca there were some really poor individual performances, and that always sounds like oversimplification of analysis. But if your players are missing passes, then what can you do? You can't sustain attacks. You can't build up. Inigo Martinez, not only was he inaccurate with his switches of play, but his timing of them was really poor. It seemed like he was rushing to do it every time rather than waiting for the right time. That space against a sort of 5-3-2 is so important as well, that left centre back position. We saw against Celta, Balde actually played there for a little bit as a left centre back because that's where the space was, and he could drive into that and use that. And because Inigo wasn't using that space effectively, a lot of Barca's play in the final third broke down. And I think that's something that people really have to remember about this system, is that because it is structured so rigidly and it has such clear intentions of where and how it needs to exploit space, that every single piece is really important. And if the defenders don't do the job in building up properly, correctly, accurately, then you don't give your attacking players a chance to actually get on the ball in favourable situations. So yeah, I'd agree broadly that it is different, issues in every game, and hopefully we're kind of. I suppose the one thing is that we're kind of hoping that at some point it all comes together, and we haven't really seen that yet. Obviously, there was the 2 final victories where it looked like that was the case. Two pretty poor opponents, to be fair, in both of those games. But I think we're still waiting for all of the pieces to fall in place together, and to really find these complete performances where it looks like, oh, okay, we can see the improvement more globally, I would say. So yeah, still hoping to see that, I guess.
Well, I think it was interesting today. Xavi was talking in his press conference, and he's obviously going to get a lot of questions about the Minimal. And I think obviously when you're talking about a future star in the game, everybody's really excited about him. And his comments, I mean, he had a lot of good, comments about what we'd expect him to say in terms of the game time management, saying there are good examples. Rijkaard's management with Leo, he had injuries at the beginning. We have to be cautious with the Minimal. It will help us in the end with him that he's 16 years old, and sometimes it shows that you don't play with the ball alone, and different things about how Lamine Yamal is learning. But I found it interesting too that Xavi said that they weren't finding him enough. especially against Mallorca, like that they were not that switch of the field from the left to the right wasn't coming all the way through over to that right side to Lamine Yamal, and you saw him. He was open quite a few times where he's like putting his arms up, and yeah, it's the exuberance of a 16-year-old, sometimes not understanding when he's supposed to receive the ball or not. But that's how, again, how you show your teammates you're available or you're more open than they might see that you might be on a switch like that. But the fact that Xavi said, yeah, I know he's 16 and we're going to limit his playing time, yes, but when he's on the field, he is still trusted to do this thing. And we actually want his teammates to find him and trust him even more for that switch because, again, that is our system. And I do find it interesting that in the post Dembele era, you see the significance and the importance still. And we can talk a little bit now specifically about that right wing here with Rafinha and Ferran Torres and Lamine Yamal doing three very different things. It's so interesting because they're three such different profiles. And
Yeah.
Xavi, it's great that I do believe honestly that he is getting away from that very dogmatic, because Dembele was his guy. So he said, okay, right wingers, that's just do your best Dembele impression. But with Rafinha, the way he's being used, as that high inside interior to end games, when Xavi, and I think this was kind of set up in the second game of the season against Cadiz, where or rather Osasuna rather, where for a number of games, it was when Barcelona was going with that four midfield before João Felix showed up. It was the four midfielders, and they would start the game with two attackers and then the game with four attackers. And that happened like three straight games before João Felix and Cancelo showed up. And in the case of Rafinha, yeah, like ending him as that high right interior is interesting to add a different wrinkle and to change what he brings and provides to you. And because it's just a weird thing in this system, it continues with Rafinha where his goal contributions are there, but the peak of what Rafinha can be, you don't necessarily see the best of him on that right wing being asked to hug the touchline. But then Ferran Torres in that same way, you don't see the best of him because asking him to hug that touchline doesn't really work because he does better in close association, closer to Lewandowski or closer to Gundogan, and having him be that right winger to add width doesn't work out. And it's counterintuitive when you have Cancelo, who, again, I'm going to avoid talking about him individually, but when you have him stepping inside, now, you do still need Ferran Torres to go out wide and provide that width. And then Lamine Yamal, of the three, is the guy. He's still the guy that fits the system the best, even though he's 16, because he does naturally he adds that width. Naturally, he wants to go 1v1, and he can, at a high rate with those dribbles, get by opponents and kind of do the job that Xavi wants from that right winger.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, ultimately, if you're looking at a winger in this system, they are generally the person that you want to just be doing the damage. So, we talked countless times about opening up space for those players. And yeah, you just want them to be able to exploit it. And often that means having a guy that can make a difference in a 1v1 situation. It's so game breaking. Whether that comes from out wide or whether that comes from the middle, you need dribblers in your team. And like you said, Lamine Yamal is one of well, I guess in the Barca squad, he is the best at it. So it makes complete sense for him to be sort of relied on as much as he is. And for Rafinha, it makes complete sense also for Rafinha to be given a more central role because, again, we've talked about for so long, his ability to. What surprised me is that, not only is he delivering, crosses to the back post from that sort of right half space. His combination games have actually been quite good. He sometimes looks quite clumsy technically. That's a bit weird to say for like a Brazilian winger. But sometimes his dribbling and the way he carries the ball, and even sometimes his first touches, second touches, they do sometimes look a little bit clumsy. But put in that kind of more central area with players around him, he looks pretty comfortable playing first time, around the corners or little back heels into players, and just being able to combine there. It's quite interesting because he he's actually had that same transformation for Brazil recently because he's gone from playing under a very positional manager in Tite, who just wanted him to stay out on the right touchline, to somebody in Janice, the new Brazil manager, who is wanting him to associate more by coming inside. And so it's very interesting that he's sort of being given a similar job now with Barca. And for me, he looks a much more dangerous player when he's given a little bit more freedom to associate because he can. He's got a natural creative flair to him, Rafinha. He does damage. He really does, put in the right situations. And yeah, it's been very interesting to see the combination of him in the right half space and then Yamal outside of him. I did actually see a funny sort of tongue-in-cheek tweet about Rafinha not giving the ball to Yamal on the touchline because he was worried that he was going to beat his man every time and then keep him out of the team forevermore. But in principle, like when you're facing very deep blocks, it's kind of it does make sense to have those two profiles next to each other. And I also kind of tangent. I also liked Gundogan as a pivot in that setup a lot as well because he just used the ball more efficiently than Romeo was doing. But yeah, that's a whole other tangent. So purely in terms of right wingers, yeah, I think you've profiled them pretty correctly. Varane, I feel, is the weakest in most aspects. He's probably the weakest 1v1, although he between him and Rafinha is close. And obviously he wants to drift inside more to make the runs in behind. And there's not too much deep creativity coming from left to right currently. Gavi obviously, did that pass against Celta, which was so important because it's exactly what you miss when you don't have De Jong and Pedri on the left going, diagonal balls from left to right. So without that consistently, it's hard to have a right forward who is, exploiting space in behind via runs because you just don't have the creativity to find him. That has always come from Pedri, De Jong, or even Busquets last season. And when you don't have those guys, Varane's profile in that right half space just becomes much less valuable. So yeah.
Well, yeah, what a perfect transition here because you knew what we were talking about next, and that is that midfield without De Jong and still without Pedri for another month as well, and now De Jong for at least a month and a half here, because the options we're already seeing what they are, right? It's going to be Gabi in a deeper position. It's going to be Gundogan potentially as a pivot, but again, not really as we'll say an eight, kind of not either. He'll either be almost a 10 pushing forward in front of Orvimeu and Gabi, or if necessary, again, he'll become just like Gabi did 2 games ago against Celta. He'll become the pivot. He'll become the deepest midfielder because the rest of the players on the field are just attackers getting forward and getting forward with Rafinha at
Yeah.
that high right interior. And I would make the prediction, I would not expect Rafinha to start as that high right interior in that system. I wouldn't expect that. I would expect him to end games where Barcelona are looking to get a result at that position.
Yeah,
I
I
think
agree.
I mean, I think you're going to see Fermin Lopez be and I know he basically was a left winger though. I mean, he was actually the inverted forward to end that game against Mallorca as well. He scored the goal from a forward position. He took the spot and the space of João Felix in that game. I mean, like for like swap. It wasn't
Yeah.
Firmino Lopez. We've seen him before now in his limited minutes as a high right interior, where Gundogan has been playing. And so, but that's still going to be a question though with the five that they have, and Sergio Roberto looks like he is not a part of that rotation, or at least as of yet as a midfielder. Or I mean, if he wasn't trusted against even Royal Antwerp when De Jong was healthy, I mean De Jong healthy, and we know that De Jong very much like an innings eating pitcher. De Jong, he's only missed 16 games at Barcelona in all this time. Like he plays all the time and eats up minutes and minutes and minutes and minutes and minutes as a workhorse. And if anything, that's my biggest fear is that you cannot put that burden on Gabi, on Gundogan, and Romeu kind of is an inning eater, as in he eats up a lot of minutes and should be expected to almost finish games at this point with De Jong out and Pedri out. But that's not how Xavi's been using him. He's been the midfielder to actually come out of these games, especially with Barcelona so tight the way that they are. And against Celta, against Mallorca, it was Romeu who was sacrificed to put in those extra forwards or those higher interior midfielders to throw things out of whack. So with the 5 infielders available, and I guess plus Rafinha as a high interior to end games, how will Barcelona manage without De Jong and without Pedri?
Well, you're losing your two most important midfielders.
Oopsie.
um, yeah, not ideal. So, obviously, like I was just saying, creatively, that is a huge miss. I also think that in terms of both Pedri and De Jong, they're kind of become leaders and focal points in this team now as well. And I really admire Gavi. Like every time I watch him, he seems to add more strings to his bow. I just mentioned the sort of left to right pass that I had never seen from him really before. he's dribbling, past players now and carrying the ball and creating dangerous situations. But there's sort of an aura, I suppose, in his game. I guess Pauser is probably the better term, technically speaking, that he is missing that both Pedri and De Jong have. And so while he's an excellent footballer, I think the whole team loses their sort of reference point in possession without those two players, which is a big deal. That's also why I really liked Gundogan dropping deeper, because he gave that. He was the guy demanding the ball and playing it quickly, and sort of the guy with the idea of what to do in possession, which seems silly, but you need that sort of focal point. And that's why although I do like Gavi still starting in De Jong's role or Pedri's role, um, that it seemed a little bit stuttering when you had both him and Romeu and Cancelo. And so I think that's going to be the biggest challenge, is sort of replacing that kind of that central leader in possession. And then obviously, in terms of the technical quality of those players, you badly miss De Jong's ability to carry the ball, drive past players consistently. You badly miss Pedri's ability to produce something unexpected, to find a pocket where you thought that you thought was impossible, or to again dribble past a player, or we all know how good Pedri is. So realistically, in a team that is very left focused, because Lewandowski likes to drift to the left, because now you've got João Felix there, um, that area of the pitch is so important to how Barca build up and penetrate, that it's just it's really tough. And you know it's so unfortunate, isn't it, that we're talking about this midfield being so stacked, and how it's going to be so difficult for Xavi to pick his starting team, and then all of a sudden, the two players that you most rely on in that area get injured. So it's kind of classic, but it is what happens. And yeah, like I said, I do like Gavi evolving there. That's something I've talked about on Twitter. I think his capacity to learn is really impressing me. So I stick with him for now. I like what I see, and hope that it's enough to get through this next month until Pedri returns. I think Pedri comes back first.
Yeah, I mean, I'll repeat what I said in the show in the last two games after in the five headlines I did about Gabi, that it felt last year like I was like saying, "Well, I'm not sure what he's not say what he's doing, but like how is he really truly affecting the game? Like you can tell this kid is very, very
Mm,
talented, but what does he need to improve? What needs to be worked on?" And to that point, I think this year we really have seen that yes, like that pausa, that really deep understanding of controlling a game that I mean, why I go so crazy for Pedri is that to have a player when he was 16, even to have that sheer understanding of the rhythm and the timing, and to be able to
yeah,
really read and understand a game was beyond what most players will ever achieve. Like some guys and some players, the top players just have that, and everybody doesn't, and that's what makes those top players so special. And Gabi may not necessarily
yeah,
have that instinctively, but very much in the case of De Jong, I think it's interesting because we think of Gabi and Pedri, and because Gabi comes from the academy, we think all these things are intrinsic. But he's such a different profile from the academy as well, that how he got to this first level is things that normal midfielders from Barcelona don't necessarily do instinctively. And that is, again, reading the game from a defensive position. That being Gabi, whose
yeah,
rest defense is just beyond what other players of his age and ilk. And I mean, he is still, I think at this point, you could argue it might be De Jong, but not really. I think in terms of rest defense, when Barcelona have possession and they're preparing to defend when they lose the ball, look at how many times Gabi is that midfielder who breaks up the play, even though he's in a higher position than the pivots. I mean,
yeah,
so that is
100%.
really where Gavi's bread and butter is and how he's got his playing time. But in terms of, as you mentioned, like that Pausen reading the game, fortunately, it's the young he actually needs to look at, not even other La Masia midfielders or Pedri or anything like that. It's De Jong has improved upon that. Like De Jong from 4 years ago to De Jong to now has gotten so much better at understanding the when to dribble, when to make that forward pass. And it's just, I mean, especially with João Felix having entered the team, we'll talk about the, him and Cancelo next. But you really see what De Jong has learned in the case of João Felix and how he's evolved. And so for Gabi, now that's the path you want to have him be on. Like, what is he missing from his game still? And then we also mentioned that finishing product. He's scoring a few more goals this year, the assist against Celta, as much as we praise it, you go, okay, is that a one-off moment, or is that something that Gavi has kind of, added to his box of tricks now? And if he does make that kind of pass more frequently, then yes, I mean, we're going to be praising him even more so than we were last year. But as I said, I did feel like that Copa Trophy, it felt a bit preemptive last season, even of what he was providing. And obviously, if you are a regular starter for FC Barcelona and they win Liga, like it does mean that you've added a lot. And so I'm not trying to take anything away from Gabi this season, last season, but I do feel like, we're watching this ascension and he definitely got better. I mean, he's getting better on the fly, and I'm seeing
Yeah.
it now the way in year 2 from Pedri. I watched him kind of make that ascension as well. But what's so interesting about the next few weeks now is that now, as you said, we want Gabi to be De Jong and to be Pedri, but that's not who he is, right? We're asking a player who's on the ascension already right now, and now we're asking him to be the most important midfielder. And instead of doing that, I feel like I'm going to be doing that a lot. And not to say that I don't like what I've seen so far from Gundogan, but I chalked up the first few weeks to chemistry. And I think the positive signs for me is that in Mallorca in particular, from the first half to the second half, I thought Gundogan was much, much better. And his associations with his teammates, especially Lewandowski, which João Felix added to the attacking core, is getting better and better. And I feel like we have not even scratched the surface of how good Gundogan is as a player. And I think his improvements and continued comfortability, if you will, because I'm not ready to say that he's like physically past it or over the hill or anything. He is still like 3 years younger than Lewandowski. Like he is not in his quote unquote decline yet for a player that arguably could have won the Ballon d'Or last year with Man City. And he doesn't
Yeah.
come to Barcelona as shell. But I do think in Xavi's system and the way that Gundogan really, like, if he wants to be the most important player on the field, he can be. And he wasn't that for Man City. It was a lot of giving it off to Kevin De Bruyne and understanding the game and playing out to the wings and kind of, again, using Erling Haaland as a more active and mobile reference point than Lewandowski even is. So I think there's some changes that Gundogan has to make to his game. And to me, those changes from him are more important than kind of, let's say, pushing Gabi even farther forward than he's ready to go. I think he's, again, ascending, and let's enjoy that ride instead of shoving him off a cliff and saying, hey, be De Jong here.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because the role of Gundogan really as the right interior in the system is as a creator. You're sat between the lines most of the time. You're pinning a centre back or a full back in order to make space for other players, and you're there to turn circulated possession into a goal. And you saw him do that extremely well against, was it the first goal against Antwerp? Or was it Betis, the really good goal that Felix scored? Antwerp, I think, when he combined with Lewandowski in those tight spaces. I think the problem is that if there is a problem, is that he's obviously come from a extremely well developed, extremely mature system where every single player understands their role to the letter. And he can very much focus on doing his job in that system and not having to worry about anything else. I feel like in the Barcelona team, because he feels like one of the sort of leaders of the team now, because he's come from a Pep Guardiola system and he's one of the best players in the world, and he knows very clearly what Xavi wants to do. There feels like he wants to take on an additional burden that he really didn't need to take on at Man City, kind of like what you're saying. Um, but the truth is that for him to play that right interior role the way that Xavi wants him to play it, he actually doesn't need to take on that responsibility, because that responsibility, sort of like I was saying earlier, should come from your centre backs. It should come from your pivot. It should come from the deeper midfielders, so that they create space for you to then exploit as that creative output. And so the dynamic with how Gundogan, actually, uh, his figure in terms of the responsibility that he takes on in this team is going to be really interesting in the absence of those other creative players, because he can do that. And but then Barca obviously lose one of their best outputs, and one of the reasons they now can break down low blocks is because of his ability to create in tight spaces. So yeah, getting that balance right and that dynamic right, and him understanding his role in the team, and Xavi understanding or Xavi imparting to him the role that he wants him to have is going to be really important, I think, and then balancing that with how the likes of Gavi evolve in the team and so on.
Yeah, well, let's talk about kind of pivoting. I kept mentioning because they've now become essential to the system, that being Cancelo and João Felix. And to what we spoke about in the 2-5-0s, that of course, flying high, you saw the best of what João Felix and João Cancelo can add to you. And I feel like it's so interesting the way that they kind of entered the team. And then within 3 games, you saw the best version of that. And to repeat that is almost going to be what I feel like for it's just the end of September here, but I think for so much of this season, it's going to be how do you replicate the best version of what we already saw from João Felix and João Cancelo,
Mm,
and what that looked like. And I don't want to take the words out of your mouth, but I give you credit as well. And I think I said the same thing on my shows right after those matches as well. That the upgrade in just talent, right? The upgrade in just sheer ability from João Felix as a left winger, and we can talk about the fact that João Felix perfectly fits that inverted midfielder forward position for Xavi. Like he really is like the dream signing at that position. I think
yeah.
that says something. But I think it's also interesting that João Felix was able to hit the ground running because of that system. But now the challenge is going to be once teams have kind of not say even figured him out, but the variations. It seems like other than associating with Lewandowski, I think the worry that I have now, having watched that Mallorca game, which I think very reasonably, without Lewandowski starting, was João Felix's worst game for Barcelona so far. As
Yeah,
you mentioned
easily.
too, it brings up that being João Felix, different challenges, especially in terms of maybe his off-ball work that Gavi was doing as that high left interior or that inverted forward, whatever you want to call it. And Gavi was doing a defensive shift that João Felix doesn't necessarily do. And people are criticizing him, but that's who João Felix is. That's generally what a forward and that left wing position is going to do. The reason why Xavi is playing 4 midfielders, but that's not. You mentioned too. That's not the only, we'll say, new issue that João Felix brings to the team defensively or even offensively. But as we mentioned as well, the ceiling now on that forward attack with João Felix on the left is astronomically higher than it's been for the last. I think we can confidently say since Messi left. Because Messi, again, regardless of who is in the center or to the left of him, he just again raised that profile so high by being the greatest of all time. But I think that potential now between Lewandowski and João Felix and whoever is on the right wing of the 3 options we talked about, that attacking core is the highest ceiling for Barcelona we have seen in years.
Yeah, and that's the biggest benefit or the biggest improvement to this team that we're going to see this year is just purely the better quality, and it's something that we talked about the last time we spoke together. We kind of joked that it was an oversimplification of the game that good players make you play better, and we should get Cancelo over X or Y prospect because immediately it's going to improve the team, and we're seeing exactly why, because you can't replicate sheer quality. And, in the case of João Felix, yes, he was really poor against Mallorca. And for me, that's going to be the big thing with him is consistency, because it seems like in games where things aren't going his way, if he loses the ball a couple of times, 2 or 3 duels with the defender, his head kind of drops a little bit, and you want him to be that character that's going to stand up and make the difference because he has that quality within him to do that. So for Felix specifically, I think that's the improvement I really want to see is mentality more so than technical ability, because clearly he has that. If he can, consistently, step up when the side is down and looking for options and needs a spark of creativity, maybe just break away from that sort of left half space a little bit and get your foot on the ball, and then play a couple of 1-2s, or just make something happen in a different way. That I think that's a freedom that I think Xavi would be happy to give him if he were to consistently make a difference. And I really want to see him become that player rather than this sort of like, you know, sort of I don't want to say slave to the system, but I don't want to see him locked in to the point where he feels like he has to keep receiving the ball with his back to goal, trying to turn a defender with no space. I really believe that he can become one of the prime creators in this team, and I just want to see him do it on a more consistent basis. With Cancelo, it was always going to be the case that he just came in and transformed the team, because that's exactly the profile that Barca needed for a right back, somebody that can come inside and create. That's going to be very technically excellent. And yeah, I was a bit surprised again against Mallorca that Cancelo was kind of sidelined a little bit. I expected him, with the absence of De Jong and Pedri, to take on a more creative responsibility in midfield, where he's kind of stuck out on the right more so than I expected. Um, and, obviously, Cancelo, when he was at City, because there were so many big name players around him, he was never the star of the team. But in some senses, in a creative sense, now at Barcelona, he can definitely be one of those players. And again, I suppose it's a mentality thing. I'd like to see him step up and become that. Uh, I guess it's very early to ask these things of new loan signings. That who knows where their mindset is, because they're only going to be there for a year. And yes, they've played under good coaches before, especially Cancelo under Pep, and should know the system. But there's different dynamics in the way that Xavi does things. So I don't want to sit here and be like, oh, they should be the best players in the team already. They should be commanding the whole setup. No, but I do think that both of their technical ceilings mean that they should be that important to this team, and that I just like to see them develop as real leaders on both sides of the pitch, really.
Well, in the case of Cancelo too, I mean, looking at defensively some of the breakdowns, teams are playing in behind him, which isn't necessarily an individual thing, more it is a system thing that I think last season we talked about there was a bunch of luck. Ter Stegen absolutely stood on his head quite a few times just in the first half of that season. But yes, by replacing the right back to be Cancelo, who is stepping into the midfield, pushing high, being a creator in the final third even, or if it's Ferran Torres out on the right wing, even in the case of Rafinha, where there are times when Cancelo, I think, is caught between two minds to overlap for him because you want to give Rafinha the opportunity to come inside as well. And that means that he's in different attacking positions than Koundé or Araujo, but usually Koundé were last year. So when you swap out Jules Koundé as your right back for João Cancelo, of course there's going to be defensive breakdowns in behind. Like, of course, that's going to take a little bit of time. And I think to that point about Ron Araujo too, I think part of Araujo playing as that right center back, because you can't play him on the left. He's so right footed that you have to Jules Koundé or Andres Christensen, and then Nico Martinez is left footed. But I mean, Christensen has been so two footed. I mean, we barely even noticed. So little compliment always in for Christensen. Quiet compliment for a guy who, with
Of
Araujo
course.
coming back, is probably automatically now the starter with the way that Jules Koundé has started this season. And then Ronald Araujo, I think, getting him fully fit and having him basically putting out fires. And Barcelona are going to get bit sometimes for that. But Ron Araujo, I think you're going to, for the second half of the season, if he can stay healthy in the rest of the first half, I think we're going to be talking about him as this generational center back again if he's healthy, as we always do. But we're going to see even more from him, I think, in terms of putting out those fires in behind Cancelo. And I think that's going to be a little bit by design. That this Barcelona team, as opposed to last year, it was built to win 1-0 or was built to win 2-1, a lot of 1-0s. And this season, I think it's going to
Yeah.
be more built to come back when you're down 2-0 or come back when you're down, 2-1, or it's built to be up 3-1 or to take an easy 2-0 lead and then kind of settle things down and make those subs and buckle down by continuing to put pressure on the opposition and kind of kill them, strangle them with possession. I think that's going to be more what, not say the style, but their path to victory this season than it was last season. And I think when we have these conversations too, when we talk about, again, the talent and the ceiling, that to me is what's battling against each other, right? Like the issues that this team structurally still seems to have, especially without Jong and Pedri, that's a different story. But the worry is always that, okay, if Barcelona have created new defensive frailties for themselves, then obviously a team that was unable to win their not only win the group last season, but they were knocked out in the group stage of the Champions League. And for a team that went from, okay, let's get into the next phase of the group of the Champions League, but to now be expected to almost get to the round of 16 with the talent they have, I think those two ideas are pushing up against each other. Being the other idea that with Cancelo, with João Felix, the ceiling and the talent of this team has raised so much attacking wise that you're saying, hey, that attack should carry you through to the round of 16 in the Champions League. But those defensive frailties for a team that already didn't get through with their defensive frailties last year in Europe, that's what's got everybody spooked and scared again in this, as we head into the Halloween season. And I see how those two ideas are butting up against each other. That, yeah, defensively, the floor seems to have lowered. and offensively the ceiling has raised. So I think that's why you always see, I read your comments as well as I try to read mine. Both are pretty disparaging, but I will say a lot of those comments again is a lot of fear mongering on the idea that Barcelona people are much more afraid of their floor than I think they are prepared to be optimistic about the ceiling. Which again, because of Roma and Liverpool and Bayern Munich, I think Culés are in that state of mind. And again, I know my Barcelona history. I also know that being the victim and being aggrieved, that is in the Culé mindset and has been. While 100 years ago it made sense, or not even 100, but 80 years ago, again, with when we talk about the history of the club, it always made sense and it's part of the identity, sure, including with penalty calls to this very day. But I think
Mhm.
in terms of what this team is able to do in Europe, I don't know if that victim mentality is necessary with how much talent there is in this team. But then again, that's me having, I got to knock on wood, or you know what I mean? Like, I don't want to get too superstitious here.
Yeah, I guess it's the elephant in the room, really, that it probably shouldn't have taken us 40 minutes to talk about. But the core difference in the team this year compared to last year is that this is a Xavi team now. What's really interesting is that I had to fight so many battles online about Xavi being pragmatic and is he too defensive and all of this stuff. This guy never ever wanted to be defensive. He came into a job where there was just ridiculous pressure with all kinds of off-pitch things happening and horrible transfer prospects and so on and so forth. And the media is constantly, just poisoning everybody's minds. And he delivered a league title by being pragmatic, and fair play to him, because it clearly was never his intention to come into Barcelona and be grinding out 1-0 victories. I think he was asked before he became coach whether he'd prefer to win 5-4 or 1-0, and he said 5-4, which is an answer that not many coaches, I think, would probably give. And this version now, with the quality that he has, the kind of quality relative to other teams that he had in Qatar when he was there, we'll see the real version of his team, which is a team that's going to win games 5-4 and 3-2 rather than 1-0. And that's going to be an adjustment for the squad, because it's a different dynamic to what they were used to last season. It seems crazy to think that a change in one position, basically right back, can have such an immense shift on the dynamic of a team. But it really can, because that space that wasn't there is now there, and that additional creative play you didn't have, you do now have, and that completely changes everything. And so I think one of the things that is not really being considered is that it's going to take time actually to find the right balance there. To find the right balance between how much do we create and how much space are we denying. And it's going to take a while, because there's also new players and there's loads more competition now at centre back, which is such a key position if you're talking about that balance. So it's just there are big questions of I suppose balance is the key word, really, that I think that people aren't considering when you look at this Barcelona team compared to last year's Barcelona. This really is a Xavi team now, and so I'd like to give him the benefit of the doubt and the time to actually implement what it is that he's looking to do in terms of what that balance is.
Last question for you before you head out here. I am starting to hear a little bit of rumblings, and again, I think this is people who are a bit overreactive about Alejandro Balde not necessarily starting the season well. And this isn't just English speakers or people somewhere around the world in our comments. This is actually from the Catalan media. Like, there are rumblings from those in Catalonia about Balde not necessarily playing his best. And I know you're probably going to agree with me here, but I almost immediately want to push back on those instinctively, because again, when we talk about talent, like even structurally, right? The game that I defended Marcos Alonso in that game against Celta, in that I believe that was the one he started, right? It was Celta. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I defended him in that game against Celta, that being Marcos Alonso, because he personally didn't do anything wrong. But it's what he doesn't do that Balde does, like even just
Hmm.
space, right? That the team improved when Balde came on the field. Like, again, even though Balde had individually a B game or C game, and Alonso, I thought same thing, had a B or a C game. Like, individually was not a fault for the goals. Like, he was trying to stay wide when João Felix would drop in, trying to be an option, trying to push forward in the middle of the field when João Felix would go out wide and create space for each other. And I don't think he did anything quote unquote wrong, even defensively. But then again, Balde comes on, and teams just have to the way they even have to orient their hips differently, right? And the half space are a little more
Yeah.
open because Balde goes just so much wider and can be so much more dangerous. Just functionally, he's so much of an upgrade to Alonso on that side of the field. Yes, but I think I don't know. Again, I'm kind of answering myself that I'm in no way prepared to say that Balde in his progression is stuttering at any way. If anything, João Felix has given him kind of more of relief, and I think you're seeing a few more crosses now from Balde because Balde is not the one who needs to make that run into the half space with the ball and dribble into that half space with the ball the way he was expected to do when, again, no disrespect to Ansu, but Ansu Fati wasn't necessarily doing that. And Abde, I mean, we saw that Abde and Balde was not a program that was going to work at all. And then as
Mm.
Gabi is the left, that inverted forward, like what is Gabi not doing? And Balde was kind of trying to fill that hole. But now Balde, I mean, if anything, he's the one guy with João Felix whose job is kind of lessened, and that's a great thing for the 19-year-old. And so yeah, I think people are now they're making a bigger deal about his, we'll say, lack of crossing, but his crosses aren't that bad either. Like, I mean, crossing percentages are like 8 to 12%. Like, they don't get off normally. And so now, if you're just going to
Yeah.
judge him by the lesser job he's expected to do and the fact that he's crossing a bit more and those aren't coming off, but that just means that Barcelona is creating more opportunities in the attacking third, which they are. They're top 5 in Europe in attacking third chances and opportunities. So, you know what I mean? Like, it just feels like we go in this circle.
Hmm.
Like, okay, you're getting less of Balde and you're not liking as much of what you're seeing, but also functionally it makes a lot more sense. And if anything, he is a perfect fit still for what Barcelona are trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I've had some doubts, not about Balde the player, but about the role that he's taking up in this team and whether he can fulfill it to the top elite
Mm,
level. Because we had a conversation when Dembele left about what players in the Barcelona team are the ones who, like we said about Yamal, Lamine Yamal earlier, that are in those wide spaces and are able of creating chances, creating threat from those areas. And when Dembele left, there was basically nobody there who could do that, and so Balde was like the dribbling winger at that point. Obviously, with Yamal, that's changed, and with Felix, it's given a different dynamic. But I did always have a concern because what you're asking him to be is a winger. You're not asking him to be an attacking fullback. You're asking him to receive the ball, and especially against the deep defenses, especially against the five at the backs, you're asking him to receive the ball in a 1v1 situation, a static 1v1 situation with a fullback, and asking him to beat him 1v1, and then to deliver after that. And it takes a very, very high quality player to do that consistently. And one of the reasons why a lot of top teams use two wingers to hold the width instead of one winger and one fullback is because of that. Because it's their main creative source is often getting to the ball into the foot of the winger and having them take on a defender 1v1. And Balde's a young player. His skill set for me is much more valuable against high pressing teams because he can carry the ball so well through pressure. His ball retention is unbelievable. He basically never loses the ball. And he can get from back to front really quickly against those high pressing teams when the space is in behind. But if you're asking him to be a touchline winger and just fizz the ball out to him and then face up a defender 1v1, he's not one of the best players in the world at doing that.
right.
And what a team like Barca demands is that one of the best players in the world at doing that. We talked a little bit about Girona before we recorded and their game against Mallorca. And essentially, their best threat was getting the ball out to their left-footed left winger Savio on the touchline, who was 1v1 against a defender who could go past him consistently. And because we're not seeing that from Balde, it's easy for people to judge him, but for me, that's not the player that he is. Maybe he could be that player someday with a lot more consistency, and if he works on his 1v1 dribbling, maybe he could be. But he's not that player now. That's not the reason that that he came into this team. It's not the reason he's been so good so far. So we're asking him to do something that is quite foreign, not extremely foreign, but not his core skill set. And so we've got to have a little bit of patience with him if we want to see him fulfill that to a high level. And the alternative is to change the system and have a proper winger on that side. Barca don't have a left winger, and that's why Balde is doing it.
Well, I think you tease people a little bit. That I think it's next time you come on. Hopefully, we're still talking about Girona as top of the league table, Julio. So yeah, again, a little teaser. We've run out of time today, but a little teaser for before we can have discussions about next time. Because I mean, we also know that if I start to talk about Girona, then I'm going to start talking Ana Martinez. Then people are going to tune out. Of course, that's what always happens. So once again, not only thank you, Jaleel, for coming on the show. But remember, it's the Purist or the Purist Football, wherever you're. I mean, most people who listen to my show are now fully aware, and I think I do get a lot of calls to have you on the show even more frequently than you are. So I appreciate your time whenever you make it. Again, follow him again at the Purist Football on X, Twitter. I mean, we're also on Instagram and TikTok at the Barcelona Pod, as well as X or Twitter. Then Patreon, the Barcelona Podcast, closed Facebook group, the Barcelona Podcast. Answer the questions I let you in. And of course, a good rating on the podcast apps and subscribing to the YouTube channel are a big help as well, especially if you are coming here from the Purist channel. Because again, I look at those numbers. So if you're coming over from his channel, welcome and subscribe to both of us if you haven't already gotten us in your feed. And it's two channels that I can say with confidence will improve how you talk about football. I always appreciate my conversations here with the Purist. And I don't know if you're allowed to say, because again, you've been stepping this season outside of the Barca bubble quite a bit. Yeah, can you give a little teaser about what you have cooking up next?
It's kind of a secret, to be honest. I've got a couple of things. Bubbling along. You mentioned I'm doing a little bit of stuff on the Brazilian national team and Brazilian teams generally, because it's just so fascinating. The football is so different at the moment, and there's big evolutions happening there tactically. So got one eye on that. But I do have a couple of things bubbling as well, sort of longer form things than I'm used to that I'm working on. So yeah, they'll be out. I don't know when, but yeah, subscribe to the channel and follow me and all the rest of it, and then you'll be up to date with whenever I do come out with that stuff.
Yeah, I would say we don't have to attack the people that are trying to kind of push the envelope here in terms of, when I look at team of football or those who really think about tactics, right? Like Brighton is doing some fun stuff this year and Leverkusen's doing some fun stuff this year. And, you don't have to be this. I know the idea of like a football hipster, right? Somebody that is pretentious and talks over and this new system and this new idea. I would always say when it comes to that kind of stuff, enjoy the ride, like understand. And it's okay if everybody covers what these new ideas are, because it just makes football as
Yeah,
a total better, right? Whether it's Girona, who aren't necessarily doing any new things, but they are doing a new thing for the level of talent they have. Let's put it that way. Like you wouldn't expect a team like Girona to run the systems they do with the names on the team sheet, but they're doing it, and it's a system more than it is even individual. And again, the same thing with Leverkusen. Yes, Fabian Wirtz is amazing, and they have some really good players, Ignacio, but like they're getting to that level based on the system that they're putting forth. I'm not going to say the manager because he might be a Real Madrid manager someday, but yeah, there's a lot of teams, Brighton too, doing different things, and it's fun. It's fun to think about football in different ways.
yeah. There's just so much happening, and there's so much access to all the football all over the world. You're just doing yourself a disservice if you're only watching one league or one team. So there's just so much happening tactically in terms of talent, in terms of style. So yeah, that's hopefully what we're continue to cover, and what I'm looking forward to really getting my teeth into.
Yeah, I mean, the counter argument always is that nobody can actually afford the subscription services to watch all of the different leagues
That
and all
is
the
true.
different football. Like, I'm not going to tell you which
That
ones
is
I
true.
don't even have, or which ones I may just find other ways to watch. But again, the Purist on YouTube, as well as the Barcelona Podcast as a podcast and on YouTube. Well, isn't that free for you, the listener? Usually, all I ask you to do of all of these channels and stuff is to subscribe and again, just be a part of the journey, follow along. Yeah, maybe buy some merch every now and again. I do have a team store reminder as well. So until next time, though, I want to thank you for listening to the show. As always, we'll talk to you soon. Forza Barca.